Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to ARA's webinar Wednesday. I am Sri Rao, your moderator for today's webinar titled Army Supply Chain Challenges and New Approaches to Addressing Them. This is a fascinating topic presented by a great presenter, and I think you'll enjoy today's webinar. Now, I'd like to introduce our presenter, my colleague and friend, March Callis. March joined the ARA team on the heels of his recent retirement from the U.S. Army. After serving a multifunctional logistician for 27 years, his military assignments included a variety of retail and wholesale level logistics and planning positions around the globe. March is a combat veteran with several deployments under his belt. He led soldiers and civilians at the company, which is 80 personnel or 80 or 100 personnel, battalion, which is about 500 personnel, and brigade, which is about 1,800 personnel levels. His last command tour was with the Defense Logistics Agency, or DLA, where he led and directed the Department of Defense's largest strategic distribution center, and he supported all of the different military branches, numerous federal agencies, and over 90 partnered nations with a 11 billion inventory and a 130 million annual operating budget. In his last assignment, March served as the director of the Sustainment, Capabilities Development, and Integration Directorate within Army Futures Command. And it was in this position that he led the Army's sustainment modernization efforts to include developing operating concepts while executing gap analysis, experimentation, and equipment modernization in support of the future Army. At ARA, March is leading the company's contested logistics business development initiatives, and he broadly advises on emerging Army modernization opportunities across all areas of warfighting. I'm glad you're able to join us today for today's webinar, and I think you'll really enjoy the topic. Please welcome March Callis. March?
Well, thank you, Sri, for that introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm March Callis, and it's my pleasure to address all of you on this critically important topic, where our Army and industry are inextricably linked and key to our nation's military success, past, present, and future. And upfront disclaimer here, I am not a degree-holding supply chain expert. What I am, though, is a former Army logistics officer who for 27 years led and managed Army and DoD units at the tactical to strategic levels, where it was my job to essentially manage supply chains during both home station training and combat operations. Over the course of the presentation, I'll cover the agenda topics you see here as we chat about supply chain challenges and the approaches to addressing them. First, in the list of, what I'd like to do first is start the presentation by offering some background context so we can better understand and appreciate the strategic environment in which these challenges exist while envisioning potential solutions to addressing them. First, in the list of actors you see here, we see everything represented from near-peer competitors and regional hegemons to non-state actors, partners, and allies alike. Among other factors, like the 24-hour news cycle, the internet, and the emergence of social media, what's different today as opposed to a few decades ago is the democratization of technology, where lesser players are now able to wield capabilities that at one time were only possessed by the world's preeminent superpowers. With that said, I think it's clear to most of us that China represents our biggest long-term competitor and likely most capable battlefield adversary. Regarding China's rise in its military capabilities, it possesses the world's largest military with over 2 million active personnel. It has the world's largest Navy, although I would contend that the U.S. has more of the stuff that matters, for instance, aircraft carriers, submarines, and destroyers. China has more tanks and artillery systems, to include self-propelled artillery. On the flip side, it does have a smaller air force with a smaller number of attack aircraft. In terms of how the Chinese intend to operate, they're striving to mimic our joint force approach to combat, seeking to gain the synergistic effects of combining military operations across all domains, air, sea, space, cyberspace, and land. These efforts are not occurring by happenstance. They are clearly tethered to a much larger national level objective in mind. President Xi's strategic goal is for China to become the preeminent regional power in Asia and the unchallenged global power by 2049. They and Russia have studied our American way of war for decades, developing capabilities specifically designed to counter ours and the manner by which Americans fight. Resulting from this is the fact that we're now disadvantaged in a few key areas, to include long-range precision fires and others. In terms of the character of modern warfare and what we've been seeing play out in the Ukraine since February of 22, today's fight is more lethal, it's fast, and it's transparent, distributed, and contested across all domains. These modern warfare characteristics bring with them a host of sustainment implications. First, and largely due to the ambitions and rise of China and the emergence of the space and cyberspace domains, we should expect to be contested from strategic distances while assuming no safe havens or sanctuaries, from the tactical level to the national strategic one and back. Commonly understood, we did not have to contend with any of this during the War on Terror, where the Army was afforded the opportunity to freely deploy forces to theater, build combat power, and establish large stockpiles of supplies without placing anyone or anything under any real theater-level kinetic or non-kinetic threat. The future portends something different. Other key logistics challenges associated with space and cyberspace domains include a heavy reliance on commercial satellites and the inexorable link between the Army and the commercial sector that significantly contributes to the Army's combat power, but does present certain vulnerabilities. Given the lethality and transparency aspects, there is and will continue to be a need to disperse and continuously displace or move around our forces on the tactical battlefield, which of course makes sustaining those forces much more challenging. There are also a number of capability and capacity concerns, force protection requirements, and the challenge of conducting large-scale and potentially repetitive force regeneration in the midst of open conflict. The Army's most senior leaders, to include our civilian leaders and those in uniform, recognize these sustainment challenges. It is why the two words contested logistics, now defined in U.S. Title 10 code as seen here, have drawn as much attention as they have. It is within this context that the Army's supply chain will exist going forward. Ensuring that supply chain's viability will be key to any tactical success the Army has en route to achieving our nation's strategic goals and objectives. Before diving into those challenges, I thought a quick and high-level review of the Army supply chain would be helpful. The first point highlights the fact that the Army supply chain is not terribly dissimilar from other supply chains, where it's an integrated and cross-functional approach to procuring, manufacturing, and delivering goods and services to the Army. Like other chains, it consists of suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, retailers, wholesalers, customers, and the equipment, facilities, and processes they each use. In terms of supply chain management, IBM describes it as optimizing this network to ensure everything gets to where it needs to be, when it needs to be there, and as smoothly as possible. The supply chain is critical to the execution of our national strategy in that it plays a starring role in the Army's ability to project and sustain combat power around the globe, one of the several strategic advantages the U.S. military possesses and enjoys. At the strategic level, there are a few key organizations worth highlighting. First, Army Materiel Command, or AMC. AMC is commanded by a four-star Army general, headquartered at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, and consists of about 165,000 personnel, including civilians, military, and contractors alike. It is the Army's materiel integrator and manager of its global supply chain. AMC also manages Army installations, sustainment level or depot level maintenance, and repair parts distribution. It consists of 10 major subordinate commands that oversee material life cycle management. At the DoD level, we have the Defense Logistics Agency, or DLA. DLA is directed by a 3-star general or admiral, headquartered at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and consists of about 25,000 employees. DLA manages the end-to-end global defense supply chain, from raw materials to end-user disposition. Consisting of 6 major subordinate commands, DLA performs this mission in support of all 5 military services, 11 combatant commands, other federal, state, and local agencies, partners, and allied nations. And lastly, U.S. Transportation Command, or TRANSCOM. TRANSCOM is commanded by a 4-star general or admiral, headquartered at Scott Air Force Base in Illinois, and consists of about 138,000 people. It is one of the 11 combatant commands that provides air, land, and sea transportation around the globe. In this way, TRANSCOM is critical to our supply chain and in projecting and maintaining combat power around the globe. It consists of 3 major subordinate commands that are neatly aligned to the 3 domains across which it transports critical supplies and material: air, land, and sea. At the operational level, the Army leverages its theater and expeditionary sustainment commands, commanded by 2- and 1-star generals respectively, to manage supply chain operations, among other things. These commands include supply, transportation, and maintenance units, all of which play integral roles within the chain. Army Field Support Brigades are just that: additional support provided to line formations in the field, focused on higher level maintenance and management of reserve stocks. At the tactical level, what I would loosely define as division and below, we have division sustainment brigades commanded by an 06 colonel that similarly consists of supply, transportation, and maintenance units. The brigade support battalions and support companies do much of the same work, just in support of smaller maneuver formations and closer to the front line. The Army Field Support Battalions, subordinate to the support brigades mentioned earlier, provide amplifying assistance to expedite supply chain related operations, most notably in the area of repair parts requisitioning. Let's turn to the heart of the discussion, the strategic and tactical level supply chain challenges with which the Department of Defense and the Army are dealing. At the strategic level, and more specifically the national strategic level, there are many industrial base and supply chain challenges facing the military and our Army today. About 6 years ago, the National Defense Industrial Association, or NDIA, began issuing an annual report entitled Vital Signs, characterizing the state of the defense industrial base. The report considers several areas in its study. Key among them, factors like demand, innovation, supply chain management, productive capacity, and industrial security. 2 report years ago, in its 2022 report, NDIA issued its first failing grade, highlighting several growing concerns. Regarding deindustrialization, as the U.S. has increasingly moved to a service-based economy, it's not a surprise to learn that 30% of those in the defense industrial base state that they are the sole eligible supplier of the goods and services they offer. This fragility is concerning and evidenced by the often back-ordered repair parts that hamper the Army's combat readiness. After achieving a peak in 1979, manufacturing employment has dropped 30+% over the past 45 years, doing so precipitously after 2002. Taking directly from the 2022 Vital Signs report, the deindustrialization of the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, has resulted in an over-reliance on foreign suppliers while limiting U.S. surge capacity, both of which threaten supply chain resilience. Lastly, the Organic Industrial Base, or OIB, has not modernized like the commercial sector has, where industry is moving towards Industry 4.0, characterized by the integration of advanced technologies like artificial intelligence, additive manufacturing, and advanced robotics. The OIB, by comparison, is way behind in onboarding these present-day capabilities. I'd like to take a moment here to foot stomp this point by using a real-world example to highlight the wide chasm that exists between industry and the government's OIB given my own experiences as a depot commander within that OIB. Several years ago, I had the opportunity, as Shri kind of mentioned there, to lead the Department of Defense's largest warehouse facility in the world. Known as DLA Distribution Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, that facility actually consists of over 50 warehouse facilities across 3 states, where we store and maintain an $11 billion inventory consisting of over 800,000 line items stocked. The premier warehouse within that facility is known as the Eastern Distribution Center, where a considerable amount of that $11 billion inventory is received, stored, and issued daily. As you might imagine, this distribution center plays a key supply chain role by maintaining combat readiness around the globe in support of all 5 military services. Within the walls of that center, we maintain a high priority issue line, a line that specifically delivers the most critically needed repair parts to the military services. And coming in one morning, I found out that we had overnight lost a key piece of industrial hardware along that line that resulted in the line coming to a halt. We, of course, quickly swarmed the line with personnel to get it back up and running. But as you might imagine, this is generally not the most effective or efficient way to move supplies through a warehouse, certainly as large as the EDC. While manning it, we got to work on finding a replacement piece of equipment. That effort began by searching across post. We didn't find anything there. We then opened the aperture across DLA. Did not find the needed piece of equipment across DLA. We looked across the nation, the entire nation, both militarily and commercially, and could not find anything. Finally, we jumped on eBay and we found that only 2 of its kind existed in the world, both of which were located in Bulgaria. So we got to work quickly in getting authorization to make the purchase and pay shipping costs to get to us as quickly as possible. And we did that. And we installed, well, we kept the other one in reserve. And it got it back up and running, thankfully. But hopefully that gives you a sense of the state of what I think the Department of Defense would say is its shining example of a warehouse. I had the opportunity while I was in command to tour an Amazon distribution center, a newer one that had been recently built in Maryland. And knowing that I also had challenges in inventorying my material, where, you know, obviously when you're conducting inventories, you're looking to reconcile what's on hand versus what's captured in your warehouse management system. And so that's not a hard endeavor when you're looking to reconcile tank engines or transmissions or wheel and hub assemblies where it's lower number of items stocked, they're larger in size, fairly easy. However, and unfortunately in this case, a large amount of those 800,000+ light items we stock are actually highly consumed, you know, small dollar items, things like washers and nuts, bolts, fasteners. And, you know, you might find your warehouse management system says you've got 3,423 washers. Counting 3,423 washers with no ability to do it beyond simply a person counting them is a challenge. And so there are certain procedures that were developed, not anything earth-shattering, like let's take the amount of washers and break them into piles of 20, lay them out along a long conveyor belt, add up the piles, multiply, and get our number. And hopefully it matches 3,453 or whatever it was that I said. And so as you might imagine, it takes a long time and is not terribly accurate. And so when it was at the Amazon distribution center, I asked, you know, how do you inventory and reconcile on hand versus what's in your system of record? And the gentleman who was running the warehouse told me that they have unmanned little aerial vehicles that fly, scan, sense what's in a location through scanning, do the calculations on the spot, and in a moment's or in the blink of an eye, you have what is in location, and it then allows you to do the reconciliation. And so I share these stories not with you to scare anyone or give away any state secrets. I just wanted to illuminate and highlight, in real ways, the differences that exist between the government-owned OIB facilities and what now exists out in industry. Some have suggested that deindustrialization is overstated, that it is not as problematic as I've described. With that said, and as a practitioner for many years where I experienced several of these points firsthand, I do feel fairly comfortable siding with NDI's position on the issue. In terms of industrial security, no factor scored lower than this one. Several data breaches coupled with ongoing economic espionage are the culprits, where it's commonly understood and generally agreed upon that China has been stealing U.S. intellectual property for decades. Most recently buttressed by a RAND report asserting that China's military heavily relies on intellectual property theft. One of the other benefits of this theft is the fact that it allows China to considerably offset the otherwise wide gap that exists between what the U.S. spends annually in defense versus what the Chinese spend. Speaking from firsthand experience as that former depot commander, I can say that our greatest risk within the walls of that facility was a cyber one, where our antiquated industrial engineering equipment and IT apparatus continue to offer an enticing target to potential adversaries. There exists a lack of competition within the industrial base that results in a concerning level of supply chain frailty. Innovation has lagged with industry partners, investing their own funding at lower rates due to defense spending fluctuations in the president's budget submissions, and the fact that many defense items are procured using fixed price contracts that are often less lucrative to industry. Adding to the challenge are the several prime defense companies that are dominating the field, and by doing so, suppressing some level of innovation. Another issue at play here is the fact that public approval for defense spending is trending downward. This really became evident during the pandemic, where Americans were more concerned about spending taxpayer dollars on other, more emergent needs. At present, we're witnessing more leaders beginning to question the size of the defense budget, where those questions are growing louder given the DoD's inability to pass its government-mandated audit for 7 years and counting. As many of you likely know, the Department of Defense is the only remaining federal agency to not pass an audit to date. And lastly, the pandemic and Ukrainian conflict have negatively impacted the industrial base and our supply chains considerably. More on these issues in just a moment, as I believe they warrant a little bit of a deeper examination in terms of supply chain impacts and downstream results. A few other issues, not necessarily highlighted to the extent as the others about which I've spoken, include inconsistent appropriations, a challenge that Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks highlights as the single biggest challenge facing the defense budget today. These appropriation challenges result in everything from furloughs and deferred maintenance to interruptions in resupplying Army line formations in the warehouses that support them. Putting a finer point on some of the deindustrialization discussion earlier, the defense industrial base continues to shrink, where the National Defense Industrial Association notes that over 17,000 independent companies left the defense network between 2018 and 2023. Meanwhile, there has been a 40% reduction in the number of small businesses participating in the DIB over the last decade. And lastly, the difficulty in working with the Department of Defense in general, an agency that is often accused of being too bureaucratic, where those attempting to do business with it are hampered by legislative, regulatory, and compliance requirements. Measures have been taken to address some of these points. More on that when we get to the solution end of the presentation. At the risk of inducing some widespread PTSD here, as I take us back 5 or so years ago to the height of COVID-19. I think we're on the right slide now. I wanted to spend a few moments sharing some thoughts on the pandemic's impact and what those impacts reveal. As we all likely recall, COVID-19 resulted in a shortage of all kinds of products, from baby formula to semiconductors. A couple of factors were at play: a shortage of raw materials and a shortage of available workers that also lowered overall productivity. And it's not just the fact that there was a shortage of materials, it's also the volatility of when those materials would be available versus when they wouldn't be. This volatility can often result in supply chain challenges, where an inability to proactively posture resources like equipment, facility access, and workers in any predictable way stunts the overall performance of that supply chain. The same raw materials that adversely affected other markets, to include the housing one and others, negatively affected military readiness as well. Inconsistency on the factory lines and in repair depots impacted everything from the fielding of new equipment and the ability to maintain combat platforms to the ability to train and operate as needed around the globe. These impacts revealed several concerning supply chain works. First, the fact that the Army lacks supply chain visibility in many cases. This lack of visibility relates to both the lower tier suppliers in the Army supply chain network, as well as the precise location and state of the material at different points in the distribution process. It's concerning to many that the Army cannot go beyond first tier suppliers in understanding its supply chain, all the way back to those providing the raw materials used at the front end. This is troubling given that downstream suppliers may very well have nefarious intentions in mind, or are perhaps providing inadequate materials. It's also troubling in that it suggests the Army does not understand the redundancy that may or may not exist below its first tier supplier line. The pandemic also highlighted seaport capability and capacity concerns, where antiquated equipment and a lack of surge capacity came to light. Challenges unknown to some, and perhaps, unfortunately, ignored by others. Also revealed was a concerning lack of supply chain resiliency. This is buttressed by the earlier point that 30% of the defense industrial base supplier community say that they are the sole eligible suppliers of the goods and services they provide. Given the elevated speed at which combat occurs today, where any peer adversary, or really any kind of adversary, is capable of quickly learning about and effectively targeting, kinetically or non-kinetically, static forces. So having to rely on a single supplier with no redundant measures in place is concerning. It's especially concerning if that supplier is tied to a key combat platform or soldier readiness issue. And lastly, a lack of supply reserve capacity, where pre-existing stockpiles were only helpful to a certain extent. A healthy reserve would allow uninterrupted supply chain operations at times when a lack of supplies and workers would otherwise cripple it. In terms of the Ukrainian conflict, turning back to that, it's commonly understood that it has depleted certain U.S. munitions stockpiles, while more generally speaking, interrupting global supply chain operations writ large. To this latter point, both Russia and Ukraine are leading suppliers of key industrial metals, to include aluminum, nickel, copper, and iron ore. According to a report published by Dun & Bradstreet, more than 350,000 businesses worldwide rely on Russian suppliers, while more than 240,000 businesses rely on Ukrainian ones. It's also important to note here that Russia and Ukraine provide 90% of the neon used for lithography, a critical step in the chip-making process, and therefore influential in an already constrained high-tech supply chain. This is unhelpful in producing critical capabilities like the Army's Javelin missile, as an example. Unsurprisingly, the conflict has caused many nations to increase defense spending, where in the case of Ukraine, we see a considerable spike to defend its homeland as we're on the cusp of entering the fourth year of the war. Russia has also increased spending, although not nearly to the level that Ukraine has. Russia is, of course, benefiting from Chinese, Iranian, and North Korean support, while the Ukraine is receiving support from Western nations. Poland's increase is not surprising given the geography involved. Their concern is real. Russia's 2014 invasion and subsequent annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, part of Ukraine, began the Russo-Ukrainian War as we know it today. I had the opportunity to participate in joint training exercises with the Polish Army in Poland back in 2016. While there and alongside other U.S. Army officers and our Polish teammates, I clearly recall being in the room for a luncheon when the head of the Polish armed forces, with the Polish head of the Polish armed forces. I do remember him shedding more than one tear in thanking all of us for partnering with the Polish army as we were. He mentioned that he and his fellow Polish citizens were gravely concerned that they would be the next country Russia invaded. So it's not surprising to see a notable uptick in their defense spending. So how does this spending impact the Army supply chain? Well, it simply highlights the growing demand and increased competition for many of the raw materials mentioned earlier. Couple this increased demand with the aforementioned supply shortages and the volatility, and we begin to understand the strain this specific challenge places on the Army supply chain. The U.S. is the one nation that has seen a dip in defense spending for the reasons mentioned earlier. Where we are seeing a considerable increase in spending is in the replenishment of those depleted munitions stockpiles. In terms of tactical level challenges, there are several, most of which stem from the dynamic environment in which the Army operates. Unlike civilian customers, where your home address to which Amazon delivers goods and rarely changes, the home address for an Army combat unit changes quite frequently. When these changes occur, what else often changes is the parent unit of that organization. This triggers unit identification and location code changes, where updates to management systems are often occurring while supplies are already en route. As you might imagine, this can make it difficult in getting the final delivery of goods and supplies to the right location and place. With respect to the supply chain, it increases the number of touch points and resources required to get the supplies where they are actually needed. And as we all know, the more times goods are touched within any supply chain, the more likely it is that we'll experience inventory and distribution errors. This dynamic environment also leads to episodic demands. For instance, an Army unit might go months or longer without requisitioning key repair parts for a particular system, but suddenly flood the system with demands when maneuvers are underway. This, of course, complicates any supplier's ability to accurately forecast demand, often leading to a mismatch between repair parts needed and repair parts available. It can also frustrate suppliers, causing them to depart the supplier network altogether. Older legacy equipment and facilities are challenges as well. For instance, maintaining a viable supply chain for some of the Army's older low-density equipment like dozers and excavators is particularly difficult. Again, repair part demands for this equipment is varied and episodic, and there are often no civilian equivalents in terms of age and type that would otherwise help mitigate the challenge with more predictable demands. From a facilities perspective, unit-level motor pools suffer from the same lack of modernization as the OIB. Most of the motor pools at Fort Cavazos, Texas, for instance, were built 70+ years ago with not much changing between now and then. As we routinely modernize and update key weapon platforms that are maintained in these aging motor pools, we often see an unfortunate mismatch between their maintenance needs and the facility's capabilities. Along a similar theme, several supply chain processes are equally outdated. For instance, the manner by which we have traditionally forecasted repair part demand suggests a focus on lagging, not leading indicators. This often results in stocking the wrong supplies at the tactical level, or not stocking them in the right quantities. Unlike industry efficiently leveraging goods to person, in the Army, we send the person to the goods when it's time to retrieve supplies from a location and get it out the door. This greatly reduces the efficiency of any packer. Lastly, at the Army post level, there is often no overarching coherent distribution methodology in place to maximize resources and distribution efficiencies. Maintenance challenges can also adversely impact the supply chain in real ways. The time allotted for on-system training for our mechanics is simply not enough in many cases. The Army's key weapon systems are complicated. They include sensor technologies, unique drivetrains, and firing systems that you just will not find on your 2021 Honda Accord. This lack of sufficient training time often leads to poor diagnostics, which then leads to soldiers often ordering a number of wrong repair parts. All this does is flood the supply chain with parts that are moving to and from the customer for no good reason, while also registering false demands that can wrongly inform forecasting efforts. And lastly, abusing the requisition ordering priority process, where non-deadlining, perhaps unnecessary repair parts are at times ordered at the highest priority level simply to get the part in and applied. This is, of course, problematic, as it makes the truly important supplies and repair parts indistinguishable from all others. So what are the Department of Defense and the Army doing to address these strategic and level tactical challenges? Well, I'm happy to share a few promising initiatives that are underway while describing a set of other potential solutions worthy of some strong consideration. As alluded to earlier, years ago, the Department of Defense consciously recognized the clunky, time-intensive, and regulation-heavy contracting laws in place. After successfully lobbying Congress to act, several new contracting mechanisms, organizations, and funding programs were born. For instance, the Other Transaction Authority, or OTA tool, is a procurement authority that allows federal agencies to enter into agreements with non-traditional defense contractors, such as small businesses, research institutions, and nonprofit organizations. They allow agencies to bypass certain federal acquisition regulation requirements, which can speed up the acquisition process while making it more flexible. It can be used for a variety of purposes, including prototyping, research, and follow-on production. A greater number of disadvantaged business set-asides have been established to widen competition and drive greater levels of innovation, offsetting some of the adverse effects caused by the largest and most dominant defense contractors. Additionally, the establishment of the Defense Innovation Unit, or DIU, was envisioned as another innovation-inducing measure. Taken together, these actions were designed to bring more innovators and suppliers to the table, an effort that will hopefully continue to impact the supply chain in positive ways. Guiding the next set of actions to be taken at the DoD level, the department issued its first ever National Defense Industrial Strategy in 2023. In the document's foreword, Deputy SecDef Hicks quotes the NDS's desire to fortify the defense industrial base, our logistical systems, and relevant global supply chains against subversion, compromise, and theft. She points to several opportunities in front of us, to include increasing our DIBS production capacity while strengthening our supply chains. I'm hopeful that this strategy will be sufficiently resourced and quickly implemented, given the strategically important role the OIB, the DIB, and our supply chain play in the defense of our nation. In terms of funding, the Army's FY25 budget request contains nearly $4 billion to replenish the industrial base and strengthen munitions supply chains. No such callouts existed in the FY24 or 23 budget requests. The Army has also developed a plan to invest billions of dollars over the next 15 or so years to modernize that OIB, about which I spoke earlier. AMC has also been at work onboarding more sophisticated analytics tools to better, more quickly, and more accurately forecast supply requirements going forward. This effort is designed to directly address the outdated forecasting methodologies I spoke of earlier. In his recently published strategic plan, DLA's director, Lieutenant General Mark Simmerly, is looking to redefine DLA as a data-driven organization eager to make its 8 supply chains more resilient. Having worked directly for Lieutenant General Simmerly in the very recent past, I can attest to his drive to create data leaders and data practitioners that will help DLA usher in a new era where parts forecasting, storage, and distribution become much more reflective of what we all likely expect should be occurring at the quarter mark of the 21st century. And lastly, investments within the walls of our Army schoolhouses. The recently established Virginia Commonwealth University's master's program in supply chain management is also creating data leaders and practitioners. On a smaller scale, the Army Sustainment University is achieving similar outcomes with its supply chain management course. Together, these offerings are producing young leaders at the mid-management level who arrive at unit formations conversant in data science, to include data collection, analysis, and visualization, programming, and a familiarity with a number of data management tools. But are there other things that the Army could be doing to improve supply chain resiliency and performance? Mr. Jason Dury, a supply chain practitioner for many years, strongly argues there are. In an article he penned several months ago, Mr. Dury highlights 5 actions the Department of Defense should take to improve its supply chain. First, he mentions investing in tools and processes. In this way, he's advocating for a more widespread adoption of efforts like AMC's Supply Chain Optimization Initiative I described earlier. By leveraging present-day tools already at work within the commercial sector, he envisions a faster, more finely tuned supply chain, better designed to meet those dynamic military requirements. He cites the Government Accountability Office's recent assertion that supply chain issues are one of the leading causes of cost increases and delays for major defense acquisition programs. New tools and processes will play a role in abating this trend. He argues for more redundancy in what he calls alternative sourcing capabilities. According to Mr. Dury, understanding the alternative suppliers and redundancy landscapes are the best insurance policy in a world where critical minerals are scarce, geopolitical tensions are rising, and supply disruptions have become the status quo. Mr. Dury highlights a need to develop a resilient resourcing strategy. Developing and maintaining stable sourcing solutions that include a network of reliable local providers will be critical to the successful execution of worldwide operations. Recognizing the unstable appropriations trend that has plagued the Defense Department for so many years now, he implores senior leaders to have a more complete and detailed annual funding plan that can be quickly deployed when funds do become available and while they last. And lastly, Mr. Dury suggests using a set of carrots and sticks to achieve greater levels of transparency and collaboration. One of the ideas that I found to be particularly promising is the notion of treating supply chain security and resilience as a competitive factor. Doing so would likely result in greater supply chain performance. He highlights other ideas to include providing benefits for allowable costs related to supply chain technology, resources and mitigation spending, or instituting a safe harbor for voluntary disclosure and mitigation of vendor risks. So we've got some ways forward in dealing with these supply chain challenges. But when it comes to developing the new trucks, aerial delivery platforms, and other things associated with that supply chain, you might ask how the Army does this. So I wanted to close the presentation by very quickly and broadly describing the requirements development process to offer you a sense of how the Department of Defense and the Army develop future capabilities to stay ahead of peer competitors and prepare for the next fight. Starting at the left end of the diagram, the process begins with our highest level strategic guidance documents that are written and published, generally speaking, every 4 years. Documents like the President's National Security Strategy, the Secretary of Defense's National Defense Strategy, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's National Military Strategy. From these strategies flow our Joint and Army operating concepts. After writing these concepts and describing the set of required capabilities within them, the Army determines if there are any gaps between the required capabilities described in the concept and the weapon platforms and systems the Army currently has. The Joint and Army communities use capabilities-based assessments, known as CBAs, and threat-based assessments, known as TBAs, to guide this gap identification effort. If there are indeed gaps, and depending on how well known and defined the desired attributes are for the future systems needed, the Army then writes a requirements document in the form of either an initial capabilities document, known as an ICD, an abbreviated capabilities development document, known as an ACDD, or a capabilities development document, known as a CDD. These documents describe the desired capabilities in detail and become intertwined with the defense acquisition system, where an assigned acquisition organization will issue a request for proposal to industry on the heels of the CDD being approved. That CDD approval occurs at the Army Requirements Oversight Council, a council that is generally chaired by the Chief of Staff of the Army himself. After the technology has been sufficiently matured, it moves to full rate production, otherwise known as Milestone C in the defense acquisition system. Last point, the Joint and Army processes are essentially the same. So anywhere you see the word joint or the letter J in an acronym, for instance, JSIDS, you can simply replace those words and letters with Army or A, and you'll basically have the Army process. There are, of course, smaller level nuanced differences here and there, but the top level process is basically the same. If you're interested in a deeper review of what we've covered here over the past 45 or so minutes, I'd offer you these readings that contributed considerably to the design and content of the presentation. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with all of you today, and thank you so much for your time. At this point, I'll pass it back to Shri, who I believe will shepherd us through some questions and answers. Shri, back over to you.
Thank you very much, March. For those who are attending this webinar, you may begin submitting your questions in the chat box, and March will answer as many questions as possible in the time remaining. Please understand, due to the sensitive nature of the topic, he may not be able to provide responses if it's determined a security risk. I did want to talk about the upcoming webinars. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation and you will join ARA for future webinars. We have already scheduled the webinars for the next 3 months. On February 26th, Lisa Schofield will present Accessibility for All, Section 508 Compliance. And if you've been a long participant for Webinar Wednesday, you'd know that she presented something similar a few years ago, but this is an updated presentation with more information and other topics covered under this presentation. So please make sure to attend February 26th, Accessibility for All, Section 508 Compliance. On March 12th, Dr. Phil Donovan will present ADA ramp and sidewalk inspections and the new ADA ramp serviceability index, and that's March 12th. And then on April 9th, we have co-presenters, Dr. Abu Sufyan and Dr. Ted Argo will talk about possibilities of quiet pavements in reducing road traffic noise. So we have many more exciting topics in the works, so please watch your email for updates or visit the Webinar Wednesday webpage. And that's www.ara.com/webinars to keep up to date on the webinars, on upcoming webinars. Next slide, please. So let's get to the Q&A portion of this webinar. So March, I think we have several questions and we have maybe about 5 minutes to answer these questions. I'll get started with this question from Alan. How does the Army's global supply chain differ from DLAs?
Yeah, well, great question. Thank you for that, Sri. And Alan, appreciate it. Two ways immediately come to mind. First, I'd say that there are differences in terms of the end products that each of the chains result in some cases. For instance, DLA is in charge of producing military uniforms, so they have supply chains that allow them to produce them. The Army then buys those uniforms from DLA, similar to what the Navy, Marines, Air Force, et cetera, do as well. And so in this way, there aren't any existing uniform supply chains within the Army itself. The same can be said for certain repair parts. On behalf of all the military services, DLA tends to manage a lot of the large volume, smaller, consumable repair parts and supplies like nuts, bolts, and washers. Conversely, the Army likes to manage its own larger, more complex and recoverable repair parts and components, like something like a laser rangefinder that you would find on an Abrams tank. A second difference, I think, is where the customers tend to operate on the battlefield, the end customer. The delivery of DLA's goods and services most often culminate at the higher levels, the strategic and operational levels. However, the Army supply chain extends all the way down to the tactical edge, reaching down to the individual soldier and vehicle crew level. So a couple ways that they're different there in terms of the supply chains they manage. Again, great question.
Thank you much. There's a question from Mark, and you mentioned the term lifecycle management, and could you elaborate on what you mean by that term within the context of the Army supply chain?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Mark, for that. So life cycle management is a term commonly used that refers to all of the activities an acquisition program manager implements, manages, and oversees to essentially shepherd a weapon system across the entirety of that weapon system's existence. Now, those activities include things like acquisition, development, production, training, fielding, sustaining, and eventually disposition. So basically taking a weapon system all the way from idea to birth and to its grave. So that's really what we mean by life cycle management.
All right, thank you, Mark. Just out of curiosity, you talked quite a bit about data science, and could you elaborate on that about how the Army units are better harnessing data science to improve supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we discussed there, we now have, data literate younger leaders showing up to unit formations, well versed in the field of data science. Those folks that had gone to those programs and courses about which I spoke. This has really allowed those formations to increasingly develop and leverage real-time dashboards to help commanders better understand the current state of things and make more informed decisions in a systems thinking manner. As it relates to the supply chain specifically, the Army is getting more adept at looking around the corner, better anticipating supply needs through the use of predictive analytics concepts and tools. And when I say Army, I also do mean, these Army formations and really being driven by these, smart younger leaders who are showing up with these skill sets. But this ability to leverage predictive analytics concepts and tools, it's pretty promising in that it should allow the Army to more accurately procure and stock the right supplies ahead of need, which of course affords maneuver commanders and their formations the ability to conduct uninterrupted operations with minimal maintenance downtime. That's the vision. So hopefully that sheds a little bit of light on how data science is being applied inside the walls of our tactical formations.
Thank you for that explanation, Mark. Just for our webinar participants, if you look at the chat, Magdalena added a few links to some documents that were referenced in March's presentation. So feel free to visit those links if you have the interest in that. I did want to ask another quick question. You mentioned the supply chain, and I didn't realize this, but the Defense Logistics Agency supply chain support other federal agencies and even allied nations. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, for sure. So as many of us here probably know, we enter into foreign military sales where we sell equipment and whatnot to partners and allies, and so DLA manages much of that, and so in fact, that warehouse I spoke of earlier, we supported well over 100 other nations, partners and allies, where we're getting requisitions for parts, et cetera, for systems that we had sold them, and materials that they were requesting specifically. And so that's on the allies and partner side of things. On the other federal agency side, an example there would be the flu shots that all of us in the Army know and love. Every October, hey, go get your flu shot. That's happening across government as well, not just the Army or the Navy, but over at USAID, they're getting flu shots. The president gets a flu shot. DLA manages that entire cold chain. And so what I mean by that is the procurement of the vaccine, the storage, packing of it, as you might imagine. When you're sending, a flu shot, from Pennsylvania to Europe, it's got to be cold packed, and so we do that. And so the flu shot that the president takes comes from the Eastern Distribution Center, and so just one example of how DLA supports other federal agencies and organizations.
Thank you again for that explanation, March. So again, we're wrapping up our webinar today. If you have any questions, March has agreed to answer these questions for the next 24 hours via email. The email address is shown there, march.callas@ara.com. We just ask that you make sure your questions are not of the consulting nature, and please understand that there may be some proprietary or security sensitivities around this topic that may limit his ability to respond. On behalf of ARA, thank you again for joining us today. Today's presentation is being recorded, and the link will be made available on the ARA Webinar Wednesday website early next week. And we will also send a PDA certificate to all participants verified by our attendance report as present for the full hour of the webinar. A copy of today's presentation will also be included in that email. Please allow about 3 weeks to receive your certificate, and we'll try to send that as soon as we can. ARA is a great company to work for and very unique in that it's 100% employee owned. We're continuing to grow dynamically, and we're always looking for great people to join our team. So if you're interested in employment opportunities within ARA's, within any of ARA, but specifically transportation and infrastructure offices, please send a brief resume and contact information to www.joinara@ara.com. Thank you for joining today, and we hope you will join us on February 26th for our next webinar Wednesday for Accessibility for All Section 508 compliance. Thank you again.